Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Chuchus. I'm the Director of Strategy at Spiders, and I've got Eric Matthews with me, Senior Security Engineer and our resident white hat hacker here at Spiders. If you're watching this webinar, then we've managed to pique your interest in learning a little bit more about 5 real-world attacks that can be executed with only a little bit of information and tools that can be found on the Internet. Following some basic instructions with a little motivation and persistence, if you've got some basic IT skills, you can run these exploits in under 10 minutes each. So trust me, you'll want to stick around to see some of these exploits in action. So why are we putting this webinar on? Well, a few weeks ago, I was sitting with our security team at Spiders, and I was discussing with them how surprised I was about the availability and the growth of hacking resources, tools, and communities on the Internet. And I was and am equally surprised with the growth and the popularity of security hacking conferences like Black Hat and DEF CON and some of the other ones that are put on regionally and nationally. I've also seen on the television a growing demand for students in different curriculums that are being offered in the universities and the schools, in which they're teaching our young minds about the techniques and where they can source some of the free tools and the communities that will support them in understanding how to run some of the exploits out there. So I asked Eric to pull together a few exploits or attacks that could be executed by simply pulling information and tools from a Google search and to show us what could be done, again, with a little bit of motivation and persistence. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric to shed some light on how things have changed over the last few years and in Internet hacking and to show us some real-world attacks that can be executed in less than 10 minutes. And really the objective of this webinar is to educate and inform our audience of how things have changed, give you a good understanding of what can be done to address some of these attacks that Eric's going to show us. So go ahead, Eric.
Excellent. Well, everybody's familiar with the perception of hackers and crackers and computer attackers in general as the underground, dedicating their lives living in the basement. Everybody's seen the movie Hackers or The Matrix. You always think of Kevin Mitnick, who was on the run from the FBI for a decade, breaking into government systems and military infrastructure. But realistically today, with the tools and the ease of access to knowledge, your attackers are really a different type of person. In many cases, they're not experienced attackers, but instead are teenagers. And we've seen this with recent attacks from Anonymous and LulzSec, and ultimately many of the perpetrators who were arrested turned out to be in their mid-teens. One of the biggest reasons for this we see is that the difference in tools and training from the last decade is really stark. We look at 1996. This is sort of the iconic how-to manual from the mid-90s called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit, and it's really it was really considered the best how-to on exploit development, and there wasn't really a lot else out there in terms of real-world tools for attacking networks. It was kind of a do-it-yourself environment, and obviously everything was a very different approach than today when you have free tools that are everywhere on the Internet and resources like SecurityTube, which is simply a collection of videos and how-tos on how to break into systems, how to conduct testing and attacks against modern systems, and ultimately it reduces the barrier for entry pretty substantially. It's also worth looking at the difference in the exposure from the 90s until 2000 until today. Realistically, in the mid-90s, you think about who had major computer networks. You had banks and airlines, universities, and the government. There was very little else that was networked out there in the world. In fact, the Internet wasn't really even publicly available until the mid-90s. Today, however, Internet networks are pervasive. The devices are everywhere. Almost everyone carries a personal computer in their pocket that was more powerful than really anything that existed in the 90s. And you see this pervasive computing spreading throughout both home as well as business, and infiltrating the business network can be a real critical issue, as almost every business requires and really relies on their computers and their networks to conduct any business at all, and without them they're in a very difficult position. So today we're going to go through the 5 attacks, as Sarah mentioned, These can generally be conducted in under 10 minutes apiece, and every one of them has a very detailed how-to and has tools available on the internet to bypass your firewall, to breach your perimeter, to attack systems, or to attack soft spots in your network. First thing we're going to approach is some techniques for using search engines and using public databases to gain information about companies and how that can affect your security. Then we're going to move into looking at web applications briefly, and we'll go through a discussion about SQL injection as a specific example of a web application issue that can really affect your perimeter and can even breach your firewall in the right circumstance. Then we're going to talk a little bit about one of the more common attacks we see today, which is social engineering, and how that's often used to gain access to your perimeter as well as to resources or data on your network. That really moves into a discussion about the modern tool sets that are available for penetration. Once you've gained access to the network in some small fashion or gained access to the physical perimeter, there's a number of really powerful tools to allow us to do attack and then also to maintain persistent access to that network. And finally, we're going to address some of the concerns about things that you may not know about, understanding how the dark places in your network can really become a risk even if they don't appear to be on first glance. So beginning, our first demo is obviously just a passive reconnaissance technique. However, there's a lot of power in these. We call it Google hacking, but realistically it's just searching with very specific queries. And this type of attack, if you even want to call it that, relies on the pervasiveness of search engines such as Google in identifying data and potential risks in your environment. For example, in this screenshot we have password files being enumerated by Google hacking, and you know, you might note that there are more than 3,000 results for these password files, and with the filtering that's applied here, there's a fair degree of certainty that these are all 3,000 of them are legitimate password files from Unix type systems or Unix similar systems that are similar to Unix. There's databases that exist that will actually give you lists of Google hacking strings. These are search queries that you can run and determine various information, and between the several hundred just in this simple database that we have here, you can generate more than 500,000 different security issues in the wild. So it's a good idea for administrators to have an idea of what's out there. In addition, there are search engines like Shodan whose purpose is to maintain a database of all of the open services and allow potential attackers or system administrators or security testers to search through this database to identify weak services, as well as to search by company and to identify all of the potential external services that a company has. And this sort of pervasive knowledge can really be a boon for an attacker. In addition, it really makes it difficult for a system administrator to know when their network is being enumerated. In the past, you might a port scan, but right now, by using Shodan, you don't have to execute that port scan, and there's no real way for an administrator to determine whether it's going on or not until the attack actually comes. So we have a couple of different ways of approaching this. You know, ultimately, you really need to know about your perimeter. This sort of attack, this sort of issue is all about your perimeter. This is obvious to an IT security admin. So you know, really just making sure your firewall rules are accurate and using the principle of least privilege, and that you're not using unnecessary services in the environment. The old practice of simply blocking malicious ports or unnecessary ports is really the inappropriate way to do firewall management. You really need to identify the few services that you do need and block everything from that. So ultimately, one of the other approaches that an attacker is going to use to bypass the firewall is they're going to try and determine, you know, what services you have that are legitimate. And legitimate services can range from FTP to web services to mail. For example, web service is often connected to internal database servers, to web applications, and a lot of times these services are located behind your firewall, sometimes even outside your DMZ in the core of your network. So by attacking via a legitimate service, they're able to bypass the firewall. They're able to execute commands behind the scenes. And this is where our discussion about SQL injection really comes in, because that's the classic attack that is allowing you to bypass the firewall to move through the web services and into the database services within the network, and then potentially escalate from there. SQL injection itself is an attack that utilizes flaws in the web application programming. This is essentially taking advantage of a lack of input filtering, and it is one of the most powerful types of perimeter-facing attacks. Now, these really were the sort of the premier attack of the early 2000s and the .com era. It has become very well publicized, and I'm sure a lot of IT administrators, security administrators are aware of it. But realistically, we still find this in the wild relatively frequently with in testing scenarios that we do. And a lot of times it's because of systems that administrators aren't aware of, or a legacy system that has been deployed but has never been subject to auditing. Or sometimes it's due to internal development staff trying to write, for example, a very quick, simple application that's providing a single type of service, but they don't realize that it's necessarily vulnerable to an attack that can really allow that to escalate. In the demonstration we have, in the second demo we have today, we're going to take a vulnerable WordPress app with a couple of vulnerable plugins. And WordPress is a common blogging software package, and it allows you to quickly spin up a blog and place it in your perimeter. And again, this is an older version. It's from about late 2009, so this particular issue isn't the greatest threat. However, SQL injection as a whole really can be. So I'm going to jump right into that, and I've actually have an animation here, a video of a live attack that we conducted, and I'm just going to be talking through it as we go through. So first, we can see it's a WordPress blog, obviously, WordPress 2.0. And we're just kind of going through it here to make sure that it's all functional and everything seems to be normal. However, there's a post here that lists some of the plugins that are in the system, including WordPress spreadsheet version 0.6. So that's something I recognized as a potentially vulnerable app. So we're actually at the screen here where I pulled up that plugin, and we're just kind of making sure the functionality is working okay. It's a neat little spreadsheet, but if we change the parameter on the URL, we notice that it's doing something wrong here. We've got SQL queries being exposed, and that's pretty obviously SQL injection, a vulnerability. So I'm going to put in a single quote here, which is really the kind of the kickoff for the most basic kinds of SQL injection, and we can see that the string is echoed there. So we're going to try and inject something here and just see that it's displayed. That's really interesting, and this is a really rudimentary type of SQL injection. So I'm going to go ahead and just dump it into a tool called SQL Map. This is written in Perl, and it's a freely available tool. It's fairly well documented. And it can identify SQL injection, which we've just done, and it does enumeration on the back end, tells me exactly what services are running. We have MySQL in the background, and then it can do things like enumerate the users, which we're going to start doing here. So we have 37 different users in the database, and these are actually the database users. So it's doing these one character at a time because it's intended to work in blind SQL injection as well as the standard SQL injection that we see here. But we're just using the tool to demonstrate the simplicity of running it, and it's realistically, you can do a lot of neat things with this tool, even in a blind SQL injection attack. But in the meantime, I recognize this vulnerability. So I think that if we do some searching in the exploit database, then we're going to find a little bit of detail about this, and possibly even some more exploit code. So let's just punch spreadsheet in here, and the exploit database has a lot of publicly available exploits. We see one here for that exact version that we're running, so that's great. And actually there's an example here that looks like it could be useful. It's a union select type of SQL injection, and that's definitely something you need more about. This one looks like it's trying to gain an admin user and password, so we're just going to go up on the command line here and paste that in and see if we get a username. It was pretty easy actually with this example. We have admin in the password hash. It's an MD5 password hash. So we pasted this into a file, and I've actually already run the crack on this. So I'll just flip over to the password cracker where we have that password crack, and we see that the username is admin and the password is admin. That cracked because the username and password were the same, took less than a second. But since it's an MD5, we can realistically crack any kind of password. Doesn't really matter the length or complexity. So in the meantime, we're going to flip back to SQL Map and do a little bit more enumeration. We've got all the databases. Let's see if we can pull some passwords on the local database users. There's 22 more to do. And while that's going, we're going to log into the admin console of WordPress. So flipping over here, we can log in, we can look around, we can really modify and mess with various other things. Obviously, you've got management on the site, so we can remove plugins or mess with pages, deface the page, or really any other sort of thing we want to do. That's interesting, but I think the real power is in demonstrating our back-end access to the database, because all the stuff we're doing here is actually on the database system itself, and that's behind the firewall. So I fast-forwarded for just a minute here to demonstrate the actual cracking of the passwords, the enumeration of the passwords. And once we've gone through this for a while, you can see that we're getting password hashes for each one of these users. So we fast forward again a little bit, and we see, there we go, we've got a whole list of password hashes. And what this is going to enable us to do is actually to crack all of these user passwords. Sometimes you can even dump the entire database out. In this instance, we would be able to if we had enough time. Definitely don't want to take an hour to dump out the database in this particular demo, but it's a really interesting sort of demonstration of that sort of power. And I think that concludes our demo number 2.
So Eric, can you tell us a little bit about what can an organization do to protect themselves against SQL injection? I mean, you talked about that one being one that's probably a little more rare if you don't have an old WordPress site, but obviously people are running web applications altogether in every organization. So what can they do?
Well, obviously, SQL injection is a flaw in the coding or the programming of the web applications. So there are two categories, really. You either have off-the-shelf applications that are made by somebody else, or you develop them yourself. And ultimately, for both, really it's about having visibility of your perimeter and awareness of the services you're running. Whether that's an off-the-shelf application or an in-house developed application, running regular audits and making sure that you're approaching it correctly is really the fundamental thing. But also there are threat prevention technologies, whether it's an application-aware firewall or a web application firewall or even a simple IPS that can do some mitigation of some of these issues. SQL injection is definitely one that a web application firewall is going to be fairly effective at catching, and a lot of the application-aware firewalls will have some technology to block that. But in addition, you really need to make sure that you have a defense in-depth approach, and that's going to kind of come up repeatedly in our discussion today. And defense in-depth, just making sure that you're ensuring security on the internal components of your environment beyond just the perimeter and then just the soft spots. And then finally, you really want to make sure if you do have in-house developers that they have education and training, and that they're using a secure development methodology, and that sort of SDLC is in place.
Great.
In other areas, we see attacks when there isn't necessarily a technical means to penetrate from the perimeter. There are often means to attack the users directly, and a lot of times this is called social engineering. Phishing is really the most common kind of social engineering, and I think most people are familiar with phishing, especially in the context of banking and other sorts of things like that. But it can really work in a corporate environment, and we actually see some of the major penetration exploits over the last several years. More than likely, as far as we know, had some component of social engineering via phishing. And really, with the examples, just here on the slide and others out there, you understand that it can be a serious risk in the environment. We do social engineering as a component of some of our penetration testing, and this is an example of a very simple social engineering phishing attack that we conducted against a multinational organization. This particular example takes a survey, mails it to a number of employees, and just asks them to click a link. We track their username based on this link, and then we also, it's bringing them to a website. And the website, really, its goal is to collect passwords. The survey is just a pretext. It gains a little bit of information about the user, and it really makes them commit to wanting to submit this page. So once they finish the survey and they submit, they go to submit, and it tells them that they can't submit it until they've given us a username and password. And since the site resembles their corporate site very closely, and the URLs and other sorts of menus have been modified to appear to be basically identical to their corporate site, in general we have a fairly high rate of those users clicking through. And so high-quality phishing attacks, in this case, obviously we had a 24% success rate, which means we received valid working credentials from 24% of users. And in general, in our attacks, we see between 10 and 30% response rate, generally in the 20s, and that seems to be it's really impacted by a number of things, but it's a fairly consistent finding. So ultimately, what do you do about that? That's a really tough question. The user education is the most obvious answer, and that really does make a difference. But there's other things that you can do. They can range from different kinds of policy and procedure to help users to identify phishing, for example, using very consistent email formatting when you're sending out official communications. In addition, you can use anti-spam and anti-phishing controls. They're technical controls that can help prevent those phishing emails from reaching your network and to prevent the those phishing sites from displaying in browsers. And those are integrated into some browsers, and then most anti-spam gateways are going to work that way. Realistically, however, some non-compliance is just nothing you can do about it. And so the only solution to this issue beyond that is to make sure that you're, again, adopting a defense-in-depth approach. That means securing your interior, and it can also mean hardening your other perimeter devices, such as firewalls and VPNs and mail gateways. Things like two-factor authentication can really help. Ensuring the technical controls around your password complexity and aging are in place, and even solutions like DLP can really help identify networks that are identify data that's flowing out of your network.
So Eric, I find phishing to be an interesting one, just because it's there's so much awareness around it now, and it's certainly one of the components that's always included in a security awareness piece, and there's been a lot of work done by organizations to create the awareness, especially if they're targeting people for financial information or seniors or more of the vulnerable public. Do you find that social engineering is still as consistent a technique or something that's in the sort of toolkit of a hacker as it was before? Is it growing? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, realistically, a few years ago, I think the technical components of attacks were much more prevalent. You saw automated attacks through worms and botnets and vulnerabilities in Windows, whether it was through the mid-2000s with the Blaster and Nimda and all of the well-known exploits, and those sorts of frameworks that came out around that were really the case. But these days, the perimeter is a very hard place. Most environments, most organizations have spent a lot of time and money securing their perimeter, and phishing represents one of the, and social engineering in general, that can include telephone calls and physical penetration as well. It really becomes sort of the weak point in the perimeter, and it's a means where a lot of attackers can gain entrance into the interior of the network where there's still a lot of soft spots.
Got it.
So, what's interesting is that kind of leads into how your perimeter is just one component of your security, and we say the old way of thinking about it is you put all the security, your perimeter, you look like Fort Knox on the perimeter, and then you layer some more security on your core data, your core database and your core web service, and you find out where your static data is, and you put a bunch of security encryption passwords around that. But we find that when we do penetration tests and when attackers break into systems, it's really the peripheral devices that are creating the risk now, and that's because there's been so much focus put on the core and the core of the network and the perimeter. So when you have systems that are unknown, when you have peripheral devices, when you have things like test and development environments or old services that are legacy, may not be used anymore but still contain a lot of sensitive data, or may even have common passwords or links, or even like domain trusts back to internal networks, that can be a real issue. And really our demo number 4 leads down that road because this is still something that we see in modern corporate environments. When we walk in, we see a direct exploit on an unpatched system. The one that I still see, and probably the most famous exploit ever, is referred to as by Microsoft's patching schema name as MS08-067, which is a vulnerability in the server service. And it's probably the most reliable and most consistently exploitable vulnerability that exists in Windows. It was from late 2008, and it affects primarily Windows Server 2003 as well as Windows XP. But those devices have to be 5 years out of date in patching. It's still amazing to me that almost half of environments we walk into, we still find this vulnerability in the system, and that really has a lot to do with attacking a dev system or a test box or a system that has been sitting under somebody's desk for a number of years. It's gradually getting less common, but it's still very common, so worth mentioning. And the other thing that to bring this back into our discussion before about tools and how the simplicity of tools is really affecting this, when it first was released, there was a fairly complicated set of tools to be able to exploit it. Eventually, it got rolled into some frameworks, but now we have things like Metasploit Express, which allow us to do graphical penetration. There's also tools like Armitage and Core Impact and some of the other ones out there. These tools really allow you to do exploits without any formal training, and a lot of it's really just point and click. You have to understand the basics of IPs and networks and services, but beyond that, it's fairly simple. So we have actually Metasploit Express right here, and you can demonstrate how simple this is to click through, go through a quick pen test, and really, identify a service. And then you receive a window that allows you to simply click a button that says exploit, insert a target address, make sure that you're only using the very reliable exploits, and then hit go. And this sort of automation allows an exploitation, and it'll simply dump a password hash to your screen. Along the same lines, there's other tools that are available that can go even deeper. We actually have a demonstration here of using this same exploit, MS08-067, to further exploit a system and what kind of things we can do with this. We have a Metasploit framework right here, the Metasploit console, and I'm just going to go through a couple of commands. You can find these on SecurityTube, but there's lots of how-tos and even some scripts that will run these automatically. All we have to do is choose our exploit, set the host, choose our payload, and that, really there's presets for all of these things, so a lot of these can be set by default. And then we simply type exploit, and we have remote access to this box. So we'll let it send the shell code. It only takes a few seconds, and here we are, Meterpreter. This is a console that allows access to the system. So I'm going to type shell, and once we have system access, we're going to type shell and go ahead and look at, we're on the shell of this box. We see we're a system authority. There's the host name. It's the test box we had set up, but we definitely see this live. And dump a system file just to see what kind of access we have. It looks like we've got full access. So with this tool, we can do really interesting things, like, for example, view the process list. And one of the things that we do here, if we're doing a live exploit, is actually to migrate into a process. So we're going to take our exploit code and we're going to migrate it into a process somewhere else in the system. A lot of times we're going to migrate it into, say, a backup software. A lot of times those have really high-level credentials on the network. In this case, we don't have anything. You saw me just quickly look through the list. There aren't any high-level network credentials on this device, so we're just migrating into a Windows system service here. ALG is part of the networking service in Windows. And then we're going to run a couple of scripts. We see here there's a couple of local administrator accounts, but there's nothing on a domain, for example. So if we do find a domain account, we can escalate to those fairly easily. But in this case, we're just going to try and crack some local passwords. So I'm going to run a credential collector, and actually this one fails because we migrated into a service that didn't have system But the neat part is that we can quickly do a get system, and that will give us system credentials again in any service, and it's actually going to escalate various services. So now we start dumping some credentials, and really these there's built-in tools and collector gathering scripts. This credential collector is actually capable of going through and gathering credentials from a variety of things, whether it's saved passwords in Internet Explorer. It gathers the local credentials like we see here along with password hashes. It can also dump passwords from a variety of other things like dial-up accounts, VPN accounts, and all these other sorts of things, and that really represents a fundamental risk to any system that's compromised. Because if it had just a saved password, for example, in Internet Explorer to some sort of production service that was more critical than the device we're penetrating, we immediately use that as escalation. In this particular instance, we have the administrator password hash and credential, and I just, since we talked about Google hacking before, I thought I'd bring this one back up, and we actually take this hash and we put it into Google. This is one means of cracking very simple passwords, because as we see here, this password is a very common password, and therefore Google actually has a reference to it. So this is might call a type of Google hacking, and we see that the password on that system was just password 123. But there's a number of these hashes that are in those systems. So this is all interesting stuff, and realistically, there's a lot of things that you can do to mitigate this, but primarily you're going to have to stay on top of patching, and that means knowing what's in your environment, knowing what's out there, doing a regular inventory of your assets. Everybody knows that you have to stay on top of patching. Everybody knows that you have to update your systems. It's just a matter of understanding that it's not only your core, your critical assets that need to be treated with a high level of caution, and really inventories and security assessments and doing network discovery sorts of activities can really make a huge benefit in that, and can help you reach out and understand your security in a better way. So in the same context as the talking about things that you may or may not know about, we have a different kind of attack here, and this one is takes a very different shape. It's something that a lot of administrators may not think about, and it's really a good demonstration of the importance of defense in depth and how focusing on your perimeter security and your physical security and user security and various other things can impact really your security, but also to have some visibility in the network. This is an attack that exploits a legitimate functionality in Windows. It attacks switch networks, modern networks. It doesn't rely on any kind of strange switching configuration. It works against all modern versions of Windows, from Windows Vista and newer. And it's possible in a lot of corporate environments today. So we're going to talk about real quick what it is before we dive into it, and that's just going to help understand what we're doing. We can imagine that there's an attacker who's listening into your network. We have a legitimate user down here, and this legitimate user is going to do a request for a website. So the only thing that's required is this website does not resolve via DNS. DNS is just a name resolution. So this DNS server says, I'm sorry, website 1 is non-existent. At that point, Windows, all modern versions, fail back to a couple of other technologies, LLMNR and NBNS, and those are two technologies that utilize broadcasts to determine their address resolution. So what it's going to do is broadcast onto the network one after the other and see if anybody on the local LAN knows or is using that name. And this is a means of gathering credentials via NetBIOS. It's very much an old legacy protocol, but it's still in practice, still in use, and it's really quite hard to disable from machines. What our attacker is going to do is going to listen for broadcasts and respond to them and say, hi, I'm this. And any broadcast for anything he's going to respond to. So then the user is going to, if they're using an Internet Explorer, They're going to request the page, just like as if this was a legitimate server. They have no way of knowing that this server isn't actually supposed to be serving them content. And we see in corporate environments that these sorts of mistyped URLs or URLs that are simply non-existent happen pretty often. So listening on a network for a matter of a few minutes or under an hour, you really are able to gather a lot of information. What I'm going to do is respond. If this is a website, for example, they're going to request the page. I'm going to put in an authentication requirement. So I'm going to do an NTLM auth requirement for this web page. What that's essentially doing is telling her browser to send me the page, to send me a password before it is allowed to get the page. Internet Explorer specifically dutifully will send that password without prompting the user at all. This also can impact services like Microsoft SQL, and it can also impact file shares on NetBIOS SMB file shares, and these are standard Windows file shares that will also react in the same way, and we can set up a listener and a spoofer for that. In the past, this was a complicated attack that required multiple different boxes doing different kinds of spoofing and listening, but recently there's a script that was developed. It's called Responder, written in Python, and it allows us to simply issue one command, as you can see on the very top of the screen, and this command starts up a number of listeners and responders and starts sending poisoned answers out to the local LAN. What we see here is at the bottom we see a Windows Vista business machine sending its credentials happily over the network to our attacker machine, and this is actually in a production environment. So we blanked out the password. In this sense, we've done this a number of times. We generate a password. You end up with this sort of simple-looking password hash. This is a LAN manager hash, so it's very simple to crack. And we run a password cracker here, and we see that we've cracked the password. And the password in this case is Goldfish5. So this whole process from firing the script to having a cracked password took somewhere on the order of about 8 minutes. So in order to summarize all of these, it's really, it's all about knowing what you have. These attacks can take place in minutes. Sometimes you won't know when they're going on. The tools to use them can be executed by anybody. They're often free and easy to find, and the knowledge to use those tools is prevalent and easy to reach. So realistically, you have to understand that your firewall, your perimeter, and your core assets are not your only lines of defense, and that you really have to try and spread your effort around. Focusing strictly on the perimeter is definitely not the best way to go. You want to have a good perimeter, but that can't be the only focus. And I think primarily what you don't know can hurt you, in the sense that you have to really understand what's in your environment, what's there, what's not there, and also what assets you may have left out of your rigorous security plans. Those sorts of things that are on the periphery, those are really the things that can reach out and come back to bite you in ways that you may not have expected. So how do we address all these? Well, running comprehensive inventories, this is important, especially internal in various places that you wouldn't normally think of inventorying. This may involve doing automated network scanning. It may involve some enumeration. It may even involve investigating network devices to determine connectivity, and sometimes involves physically inspecting the environment to determine what you have. Once you've identified those assets, you want to go out and make sure that you understand the threats on those, and that can range from just simple brainstorming about those about threats and potential threats to we recommend having a vulnerability and going through regular security audits. So these security audits will help you understand the vulnerabilities. if the scope is appropriate and it includes assets that aren't just simply in your core but includes all assets, you can really get a better view of the actual risk profile, because when we focus so much on the core, a lot of times you really miss a lot of critical things. And when we do an open-ended penetration test, we very seldom are penetrating the core directly. We're going to penetrate a peripheral asset, and then we're going to escalate that into the core in just a couple of steps. In addition, education for users is an important component of that. Role-specific education may include IT administrators. It may include server administrators, understanding how to harden their systems and how to manage them better. It can also include developers in how to develop and code best practices for input validation to control SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and any of the other OWASP vulnerabilities. And in addition, you really want to make sure that you're spreading out your dollars and your effort. Certainly you want to prioritize your effort to high risks and high severity issues and high visibility data, but you can't focus on your core to the exclusion of the peripheral.
That's great, Eric. I mean, I think you've provided a lot of really valuable information and some great insight into some of the common attacks that are out there that can be easily executed. One of the key takeaways for me that I think you repeated a few times throughout the presentation, which I'll just echo again, is the need to not forget about the peripheral devices and to really understand what's out there and connected to your network, but also to stay on top of the evolving attacks or the common attacks. So whether that's subscribing to forums or making sure that you've got somebody who is well versed in understanding what is happening out there to give you the advice and to share with you so that you're on top of those attacks and what's happening, so you understand who your opponents are out there. So if you're looking to find any more information about what Eric's talked about today, or want some additional tips and tricks from Eric, or have some specific questions, you can certainly send us an email at info@spiders.ca, or give us a shout at our local 416 number, or 1-800-1888 number, that is. Otherwise, our Spiders blog and our Spiders website does have content and will be updated regularly with additional content as we go through and find some more useful information that we want to share with our audience. So with that, thanks very much, Eric, and thanks everyone for listening.